Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those returning for evening number 2 of the Buddhist Study Center 2020 summer session. And aloha for those attending for the first time. I'm Dexter Marr, and I'll be your summer session moderator. For those joining for the first time, thank you for participating in the 46th Annual Buddhist Study Center summer session. For those who attended yesterday, I will repeat some of the basic introduction for housekeeping purposes. The Buddhist Study Center of Hawaii opened its doors in 1972, inspired by Bishop Kanmo Imamura and led by BSC Director Reverend Tatsuo Maneto. The first summer session began 2 years later in 1973 with a 4-week course of study led by instructors Dr. Alfred Bloom and Dr. Mokusen Miyuki. The 2020 summer session is the first online version and offers the opportunity to share the teachings not only in Honolulu, but globally. For the past several years, the in-person classes have been augmented with live streaming, primarily for our neighbor island Sanghas. This year, through technology and the opportunity of the COVID-19 pandemic, we share Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams' insights with a much broader audience. The technology we're using is a combination of YouTube and Skype. So viewers are in broadcast mode, like watching a live TV program. The virtual studio is from Skype. So the only direct interaction from you, the audience, to Professor Williams is via the chat mode in YouTube. So please send your questions and comments via chat at any time, and we'll select questions from there for questions and answers. The format of the evening will be about 40 minutes of presentation by Duncan, followed by about 15 minutes of questions and answers. Then a 10-minute break for home refreshments, stretching, etc., and then we'll repeat. This presentation will immediately be available on YouTube, so if you need to break away, portions or the entirety can be viewed at a later time. A full syllabus of homework is available at the BSC website, so you can prepare for each evening's subjects in advance. Please bear with us at the Buddhist Study Center as we learn how to produce these types of educational programs and the technology required. We selected the YouTube Skype approach for the ease of connecting, as well as the reliable connection from the BSC studio. We're delighted to have Professor Williams share his knowledge with us in our virtual Hawaii classroom. Duncan is a frequent visitor to Hawaii, having participated in the 2014 Numata Conference hosted by University of Hawaii Manoa and the Buddhist Study Center. Also, the 2015 Bloom Futaba Memorial Lectures and the American Sutra book tour last year. So we look forward to the day when he can join us again in person. Professor Williams is a full professor of religion at the University of Southern California and director of the Shinsho Ito Center for Japanese Religion and Culture. Among his many published books and articles is the groundbreaking work, American Sutra, which will be featured in tonight's lectures. In particular, Professor Williams will share little-known perspectives of Hawaii under martial law that could not be included in the final version. This book is available at the Hawaii Hongwanji bookstore website, as well as the Buddhist Churches of America online bookstore, and of course, Amazon. So tonight's subject is Interlinked, Buddhism in Hawaii during World War II. And the readings were chapters 1 and 2, if you had a chance to speed read it, this afternoon. So Duncan will speak for about 40 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. And I'll turn this over to Duncan.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dexter, for the kind introduction again and setting up things for day 2 of, or I should say evening, I guess, 2 of our summer seminar. I'm so glad to be able to join you again And tonight, we're going to follow on some of the things we discussed yesterday, but I'll try to do it in such a way that if you didn't have a chance to participate in the day one of the seminar, you would still be able to follow what I'm going to hope to present tonight. As Dexter mentioned, one of the aspects of this evening's presentation is that I'll be relying on doing some reading from this book that I wrote that Dexter mentioned, American Sutra, as well as some things that didn't get into the book about why Hawaii is such an important part of the American Buddhist story, and in particular, the American Buddhist story during World War II. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation, and I'm just going to verbally let the studio know that I'm doing that. And I think there's a little bit of a delay in it showing up on your screen on YouTube. But today, I'm going to focus on this book that came out last year, American Sutra, A Story of Faith and Freedom in the Second World War. It's really about Buddhism and the World War II Japanese-American incarceration, but also about what happened in Hawaii, what happened in the military, in the Pacific, and in the European theater. It also talks about resettlement, what happened to Buddhism in Hawaii right after the war ended. And so it's a book that tries to do a fairly long durée history of different aspects of the World War II Japanese-American experience. And tonight, I'm going to be focused on Hawaii. And so I want to start today by reading a section, and I know some of you may have been able to get to it, but for those who haven't especially, I want to do a little bit of reading from the book itself to give you a little flavor of some of the sections, but also I'll be supplementing it with some other comments. But I'm going to start today with this whole question of what happened in Hawaii in the immediate aftermath of the Pearl Harbor attack. Oh, let me try that again. Hi, everybody. I'm hoping that the PowerPoint presentation is showing at this point, but let me get a confirmation before I go on. Okay, so, okay. I'm going to start today with a reading then, so that we can wait for the PowerPoint to load. But I'm going to start with a reading from the very beginning of chapter 1 of this book, American Sutra. It's a chapter titled America, Nation of Religious Freedom. And it starts like this. Like most Americans in 1941, Japanese Americans reserved Sundays for religious, family, and sports gatherings. The vast majority were Buddhist, and from around 8 a.m. on the morning of December 7th, many on the Hawaiian island of Oahu were arriving at their temples. At a Sunday school hosted by the Zen Buddhist-affiliated Nanagakuen in Honolulu, 11-year-old Chie Sumiya was singing a popular Japanese children's song, Ame, Ame, Fure, Fure, Rain, Rain, Fall, Fall, when the cheerful chorus was interrupted by a loud noise. Unbeknownst to the children, the Imperial Japanese Navy's planes had commenced their devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would declare it a date which will live in infamy. Our teacher in charge told us it wasn't anything to worry about and to continue singing, recalled Chie many years after the attack. A few minutes later, a second boom sounded, and soon after that, the third boom struck our building, she said. The auditorium shook, Debris was flying all over and children were screaming. We were all frantically trampling down the wide stairway like a herd of cattle. And going down, I witnessed children who were badly hurt. I later found out that the girl sitting close to me had died from shrapnel wounds. At least 4 Japanese American children under the age of 8 died that day. By 9 a.m., American anti-aircraft defenses were firing at the second wave of Japanese planes attacking the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor and the U.S. Army Air Corps bases at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field. The initial Japanese wave had already hit these and other military installations in a surprise operation aimed at crippling the capital ships of the Navy's Pacific Fleet and grounding any air capabilities that could challenge the attack. In the chaotic response, some of the anti-aircraft rounds went RE and landed in the civilian areas of Pearl Harbor and Honolulu, killing an estimated 70 civilians. One of those misfired shells landed without exploding in the driveway of Territorial Governor Joseph Poindexter's home. Another killed Private Torao Migita of Company D, 298th Infantry Regiment, who had enlisted in the U.S. Army to serve his country 6 months earlier and was returning for a weekend pass when that shell struck. He was the only Japanese American member of the U.S. Armed Forces among the 2,335 American servicemen who perished in the attack. Later that day, when Private Migita's 65-year-old mother learned of her son's death, she searched for a Buddhist priest to officiate at the young U.S. Army soldier's wake and funeral. But Buddhist priests were suddenly unavailable. So that's the opening of the first chapter in American Sutra. It tells of some of these stories, such as that of Chie Itagaki, who you see in this slide on the right. I had a wonderful opportunity to meet up with her when this book came out. It was in fact earlier this year, before the whole pandemic travel restrictions. I had a chance to visit Honolulu and meet with her and share a photo with a copy of the book. But she was the 11-year-old attending that Soto Zen Buddhist Sunday School, Anagakuen, singing that song, Ame Ame Fure Fure. And she was the one who witnessed this girl who died in her Buddhist classroom. And so one of the points I wanted to make up front on today's topic was that we think we know all about the Pearl Harbor attack, and there's so much written about it. But there's many untold stories that we don't know. We don't know about the stories of 11-year-old Chie Itagaki, or this Japanese-American U.S. Army private who died as a member of a Buddhist temple, but also, the Honolulu Shinshu Buddhist Shinshu Kyokai. But it's a kind of little known fact. 11-year-old Japanese American affected U.S. by the attack by the Japanese private who died. And so I wanted to kind of start with a Buddhist temple, kind of but knowledge that the Honolulu Japanese American Buddhists who also heard Buddhist Shinshu Kyokai that attack. By the Japanese Navy, and also kind of little known fact 11-year-old with this statement how Japanese American Setsumita's mother, a member also of this Buddhist temple, Shinshu Kyokai, went out to try to find a Buddhist priest who could officiate her son's tragic death in the attack. But unfortunately, she couldn't find one. And that's one of the kind of other big stories I wanted to talk about tonight, is that in Honolulu, in many other parts of the Hawaiian Islands, right there on December 7th, 1941, Buddhist priests were picked up by the FBI and other agencies in what they called a custodial detention program, where people who had been identified as threats to national security were rounded up, having been on lists made prior to the war of people who were considered threats and potential threats to the United States of America. Now, for those of you who heard me yesterday, you know a little bit about why the politicians, intelligence services, the media, and the general public at that time seemed to associate Buddhism as either un-American or, even anti-American, a threat to national security. But another lesser-known story of that Pearl Harbor period is the ways in which Buddhism was targeted, and that Buddhist leaders were on the first group of people arrested by the FBI. And one of the findings of the book, which I found really surprising to discover, was that the very first person that the FBI rounded up at 3 p.m. that day, even before the 3:30 martial law order had been instituted, where the territorial government, the civilian government, was replaced with a military government for national security purposes. Even before martial law had been declared, 30 minutes before, the first person amongst the Japanese community leaders, and they picked up a lot of them that day, December 7th, 1941. But the very first was Bishop Gikyo Kuchiba of the Honpa Hongwanji Buddhist Temple, which is, of course, the sponsor of the Buddhist Study Center and people associated with this tradition of Jodo Shinshu. The bishop of that tradition was the very first person targeted and picked up. Now, some of you know that I'm also a Soto Zen Buddhist priest, and so among the next people picked up, you think like consular officials be picked up, or maybe some leading Japanese, sympathize, but no, it was just Buddhist priests were targeted in this initial roundup, and at the Soto Zen temple, Taiheiji, that was one of the other temples that I write about in American Sutra, of the priests getting picked up right away in the hours after the attack, before the smoke had even cleared. Now, the other thing you see on this slide is that on December 7th, 1941, that Sunday morning, Japanese America was majority Buddhist. About 80% of the Issei and 67.8% of the Nisei were Buddhist, and then others were Christian, both Protestant and Catholic, and some identified just with like Shinto or Shinto new religions like Konkokyo and so forth. So those people represent about 1%. But as you can see, the vast majority of both the Issei as well as the Nisei were Buddhists at that time. And in terms of temples, you can see that most of them did belong to that denomination, Nishi-Hongwanji or Honpa Hongwanji, of the sect that Bishop Kuchiba was associated with, although there were many other denominations and their temples representative in America and in Hawaii and the mainland continental United States as well. But you can see that Hawaii and the kind of overwhelmingly held the majority of Buddhist temples. Among the 362, 183 of them were in one territory. And you can see California comes close as the next state that has the largest number of temples. So that was the situation for Japanese Americans on December 7th, 1941. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is this question of the Buddhist priests being targeted. I mentioned Bishop Kuchiba. I apologize, the next slide has Reverend Horyu. It's supposed to be Asaeda, and there's an extra D in there, of the Liliha Hongwanji mission. If you go to, whenever I go to Honolulu, one of the places I love to visit is Liliha Bakery and the cream puffs and whatnot. But right next to Liliha Bakery, a couple of blocks away, is the Liliha Hongwanji mission. And the Buddhist priests of that temple, you can see on this slide on the left-hand side, being arrested and taken to the Honolulu immigration station, his fingerprints being taken and booked at the immigration station. Now, in terms of the internment, this is something one could say in general about Hawaii as well as the continental or mainland United States. Most people who were picked up that day, including the Buddhist priests, were taken initially to a temporary detention station of some kind. It could be a county jail, it could be an immigration station, it could be some other facility. For example, on some of the other islands, like for example the Big Island, Waiakea Prison Camp was one location. The Hilo Independent Language School was another temporary detention facility. And on Maui, it would be like the Wailuku County Jail or the Haiku Camp. So every location, including in the mainland, the LA County Jail was a temporary detention station for people who were arrested on December 7th on the mainland as well. So people were initially booked, like you see here, Reverend Asada Horyu or Horyu Asada being booked and taken into custody. But in the case of Hawaii, almost immediately, most people were funneled to one of two internment camps. The two big ones on the Hawaii Islands were Sand Island, which is what you see on the left with the tents, and then the barracks you see on the right at Honouliuli. And so Sand Island, of course, is in Honolulu Harbor, and Honouliuli in the Gulch there, in Honolulu on the island of Oahu. And these two camps have been studied very well in the last several years by researchers at the Japanese JCCH in Honolulu, Community Cultural Center in Honolulu. That they have done not only documentary and photographic research, they've created what is called the Hawaii Internee Directory, which is a wonderful database to learn about individuals who spent time in these two camps and other temporary detention stations, such as the ones I mentioned. And they also track in that internee directory where some of these individuals ended up on the mainland. And the main difference between Sand Island and Honouliuli is that Sand Island was a location where, through the transportation over 10 different ships across the Pacific, ended up in places like Angel Island as a drop-off point. But a very large number of the Issei community leaders, including hundreds of Buddhist priests, taken from all of the islands of Hawaii, were transported eventually out of Sand Island to mainland internment camps for longer-term internment. And whereas Honouliuli in the main, and there are some exceptions, but in the main, Honouliuli held Kibe or Nisei American citizens who may have had some years of living in Japan, education in Japan. They may have been on some kind of FBI list because of some supposed sympathy towards Japan. It was harder to take American citizens and ship them off to without any kind of due process to the mainland camps, and so many of them were held at Honouliuli. But as I'll get into in a moment, Honolulu held Buddhist priests who are Issei and so on as well, but they were fewer in number, and mainly they were at Sand Island. Now, one of the things I want to show you is, people being rounded up, taken to places like the Sand Island and Honolulu for internment, often indefinite incarceration, especially if they were in what the FBI classified as Group A. Now, the FBI, even before the war, the FBI, as well as the Office of Naval Intelligence, Army G2, all of these intelligence agencies worked to come up with contingency plans in case war with Japan came about. For example, in the case of Hawaii, they had an entire plan in place so that they could declare martial law quickly, so that they could shut down Japanese ethnic newspapers and radio stations and so forth, so that they could raid the Japanese consulate, so that they could round up individuals that they deemed a threat to national security. And they had eventually, these various agencies came up with a classification system of relative danger and threat to national security, and they said those in the A group are the most dangerous, and B and C are also people to be surveyed. They might be a little bit dangerous, but we need to survey them, can restrict them, and so on. But Group A people were people who should be picked up, and as you can see in this form, which was the FBI case file of Reverend Buntetsu Miyamoto of the Haleiwa Jodo Temple, or Kaikyodo, the Buddhist temple of the Jodo sect up in Haleiwa. He was classified in the Group A category, and as I mentioned, Bishop Kuchiba, all these other people who were rounded up on December 7th or 8th of 1941. And you can see that there's a warrant of arrest. That's what you see on the right-hand side, and it's very swiftly they had coming out of Fort Schaffner these warrants of arrest and a custodial detention program to round up community leaders, and you can see they become and so-called enemy alien or alien enemy, and sometimes conflated also with prisoner of war. And in the case of Buntetsu Miyamoto's Fort Schaffner interview, some days after he was arrested, he's asked, whether he would fight for America or for Japan, and he gives some answers. For example, when he's asked, would you not help fight them, meaning the Japanese from our shores, yes or no? And his answer is, I'm a Buddhist, and as such, we want peace. In that case, I would help America, which is an interesting kind of answer, but one that was unsatisfactory to, obviously, the intelligence agencies that had him on a list as a Buddhist priest that would be considered a threat to American national security. And so, I mentioned this because there was a huge difference between how Buddhist and Shinto clergy were treated in contradistinction to Christian ministers. Even though there were many Christian ministers who were, Issei or Japanese nationals, often although there was obviously some percentage of them picked up, especially if they had some association with the consulate or with Japanese language schools, almost inevitably the targeting was highly disproportionate for Buddhist priests and Shinto priests. Shinto priests were, in fact, we believe that 100% of Shinto priests were rounded up whereas 70-some% of Buddhist priests were rounded up in this initial internment custodial detention phase, while only 20 or 30% of Christian ministers suffer the same treatment. And so why is that? And here in this slide, you can see that the Army, you can see that the Navy, as well as the FBI, all from as far back as 1918, so this is as far back as World War I, began surveillance on Buddhist temples, began thinking about the relative loyalty between Buddhists versus Christians. And in fact, it's not listed here, there was an important report in the 1930s that identified the relative loyalty of Buddhists versus Christians in case America went to war, that was conducted by the Army G2. And so you can see in this document, this so-called survey of Japanese situation in Hawaii, identifying these kind of problems of the Buddhist temples and the Shinto shrines and the Japanese language schools as a so-called military liability of the Japanese in Hawaii in case of war with Japan. In other words, even though we often talk about the Pearl Harbor attack as a surprise attack and as a, and what happened thereafter as if it were a kind of like a act of war hysteria, that people were rounded up because the authorities were scared about who they could trust. It turns out that well before Pearl Harbor, as far back as you can see even here in 1933, there were already notions within the intelligence agencies that America would inevitably go to war with Japan, and that they needed to investigate the kinds of groups that might serve as a threat to American national security. And then the last thing you see here is by FBI Director Hoover, who in 1940 November memo talks about how actually his assessment, the FBI's assessment, is that the vast majority of even the Issei would be loyal to America in case of war, but that a small minority was dangerous. And he particularly cited Buddhist and Shinto priests, the Japanese language school teachers, consular agents, and alien Japanese businessmen, a small percentage of them. And so recommended interning this inner circle. And there's a lot that happened in Hawaii with the Hawaii office of the FBI, Shivers, Burns, the police department, they actually helped to delimit the roundup to a so-called inner circle, unlike what Washington, D.C. had hoped the roundup would consist of. But nevertheless, people were rounded up in very large numbers if they were prominent Buddhist leaders at that time. Now, I want to go back to Sand Island. This is a letter that was written in Japanese, I tried to translate here, written by Bishop Kubokawa, or Kyokujo Kubokawa. And what I want to do is, before that, read another, again, I just want to today intersperse my comments with some reading. And so I want to read another section out of American Sutra before we get to this text about what life was like on Sand Island. This is, if you have the book, from page 47. To house those swept up as dangerous enemy aliens, the military established the Sand Island Detention Center, a former public health quarantine station on a small island in Honolulu Harbor on December 8th, the day after the attack. Contravening Geneva Convention rules, the Buddhist priests and other internees are forced to build their own prison, living in tents for the first 6 months of their detention until the compounds were completed. Almost everybody detained on the island spent time there before it closed in March 1943. The first couple hundred Japanese imprisoned at Sand Island had to build their own prison fences the day after their arrival, according to a memoir by the Zen priests of the Waiahole Tomonji Temple. Quote, The men who dug the holes for the fence posts and pulled wheelbarrows filled with mixed cement felt humiliated to be prodded along by guards bearing guns, unquote. About 10 feet before the barbed wire fence was a white line that demarcated the zone beyond which anyone who crossed would be considered a fugitive and could be shot. 3 close calls occurred within the first few weeks when a Buddhist priest, a Shinto priest, and a Japanese language school principal each disregarded the line and were nearly shot. The detainees lived 8 men to a tent, with cots simply placed on the ground. They were not allowed to keep their trunks with them. Luggage was kept in a separate storage area. And in the 6 months before the barracks were built, they slept on wet ground as rain poured into their tents. This particularly affected any elderly detainees who suffered from arthritis, pulmonary problems, or other common ailments of age. The food served presented another difficulty for this primarily Issei group. Accustomed to Japanese cuisine with its reliance on rice, vegetables, and fish, they, especially those Buddhist priests who were religiously vegetarian, did not relish the daily meals of pork, beans, and bread served up to them by a German detainee cook. And so Sand Island's camp director, Captain Karl Eifler, was irritated when the priests and others did not finish all the food given to them. He announced that the Japanese who failed to finish the food on their plates would be served their leftovers at the next meal. When one elderly internee who had been picked up without his dentures attempted to throw away a tough piece of meat full of gristle, Eifler ordered him to clean his plate. As a solution, a Nichiren Buddhist priest proposed growing vegetables on the site. He pulled together a group of priests of different sects, and they secured permission to plant lettuce and other greens. The bishop of the Jodo Buddhist mission tended the garden in the only clothes he had, his priestly robes that he had been wearing when he was arrested. Although most of these men were transferred to the continental United States before they could enjoy the fruits of their labor, some of the vegetables are harvested the following February by other detained Japanese leaders arriving at Sand Island. Since Eifler generally regarded the detainees as highly subversive individuals, the Buddhist priests were under constant surveillance. On one occasion, Eifler forced them to strip naked and stand in the burning sun to extract a confession after a spoon had gone missing from the mess hall. Eifler believed that a stolen spoon could be used as a weapon. It was later found lying on top of the mess hall cupboard. During a routine inspection on December 14, 1941, Reverend Ryoshin Okano, a Nishi Hongwanji Buddhist priest from Pearl City, was found to have made a crude and flimsy knife from a metal strapping tie so that he could cut up food into smaller bites. What happened next would later be referred to by the detainees as the Okano incident. According to a later count, quote, everyone in the group was gathered into an open field and forced to strip, have their anuses probed, and stand in the cold until the guards were satisfied that no one else had anything dangerous hidden in their clothes or tents, unquote. As another detainee recalled, it was the most unusual sight, both pathetic and comical, of a group of men, young and old, including elderly men such as Bishop Kubokawa, Bishop Kuchiba. Everyone was angry at the commander, not at Reverend Okano, unquote. So the Jodo-shu bishop, who had been arrested on December 7th, who's mentioned here as somebody who tended that garden because they wanted to have some vegetables to eat, and as a member of one of the men who had to be stripped naked, he writes a letter here that you can see on your screen. This is, again, I tried to translate from English, Japanese into English. He says, we had been living in tents on a small island, Sand Island. It was as if I was having experienced just like Honen Shonin when he was exiled. On January 15th, we held a memorial service for our sect's founder, Honen Shonin, despite not having a scroll with the sacred words, Namo Amida Butsu. Having been locked up in a remote place where we couldn't prepare any incense, flowers, or candles, we gathered all Jodo sect members together and gave gratitude to the teaching simply by placing our palms together and reciting Buddhist scriptures. The Jodo mission of Hawaii Betuin in Honolulu was occupied by the U.S. Army. There are a total of XX Jodo mission priests from the various islands of Hawaii who have already been captured and sent to the U.S. mainland. The priests have been dispersed to various internment camps, but I do not know who and where they have all been taken. May 13, 1942. So a couple things from this letter that becomes clear. He's arrested on Pearl Harbor Day, but he's still there in May of 42 when some of those ships that have been taking people out of Sand Island to the mainland internment camps have left. He still hasn't left. And he talks about the fact that his temple has been taken over by the U.S. Army, as had many Buddhist temples on the islands. And he talks about how XX, meaning he actually had a number of the Jodo mission priests, but since this was a letter that the United States government censored, they cut out that number as a matter of national security. So it's just blanked out there, and that's why it says XX. But he's trying to give, this is a letter that he sent to his headquarters in Japan, trying to account for what's going on as he is spending time in this place called Sand Island in internment. Now, I mentioned him because he's one of these interesting characters that appears quite a few times in American Sutra. And I wanted to read to you one more very, very short piece about when he eventually gets sent to the mainland. He ends up in a place in Wisconsin called Camp McCoy, which is famous for other reasons later in our story this evening. But he goes to a place called Camp McCoy, and he's there to spend in 1942 the first Buddhist birthday. I'm sorry, not 40, in 1943, the first Buddhist birthday on the mainland among the internees. And this is what happens. And so I'm going to read, this is on page 86. And this is, again, Bishop Kubokawa. He says, at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Bishop Kyokujo Kubokawa of the Jodo sect, the priest who had been arrested in Hawaii in his Buddhist robes, officiated at the first Buddhist ceremony. With these robes, he had arrived in the internment camp as the only priest with the appropriate attire to officiate at such an auspicious occasion. And this is talking about, obviously, Hana Matsuri, or the Buddha's birthday. One priest wrote that he had only a single pair of underwear, a pair of pants he'd been unable to wash, and a belt made of rope. And to the disheveled men, Bishop Kubokawa delivered his sermon. Your participation in these filthy clothes can be likened to the Buddha's teaching of the lotus blossoming in the mud, he said. In these muddiest of waters, the men found ways to embrace all manners of karmic hindrances to realize the lotus mind of freedom, wisdom, and compassion. And so that's a story that I find really fascinating. A story about how, this person, all this time after the fact, finds himself, still wearing clothes that he had on the day of his arrest back in December 1942. And he connects that fact of wearing dirty clothes, disheveled as it is, as representing something very important in a Buddhist teaching. The idea that that comes from this Buddhist image about a lotus flower blossoming above and arising out of muddy waters. And his message to everybody, using this metaphor, which is usually about this idea that you can find awakening, enlightenment, liberation, represented by the lotus flower that the Buddha sits on, kind of rising up above the muddy world, the Saha world, the dusty world of suffering and delusion and hatred and anger, and that you can rise above it like the lotus flower if you practice Buddhism. And he was saying, you can practice Buddhism here despite these dirty clothes, or perhaps because of these dirty clothes, because it's the teaching suggests that it's actually because of hardship, because of muddiness, that the lotus flower has nutrients to actually rise up above and grow tall above the muddy water. So I want to just be cognizant of the time. I know it's about 8:46 now, and maybe speak for another a few more minutes before asking you for your questions. I'm going to maybe take another 5 minutes max to kind of end part one of this evening's presentation. And then I'll ask Dexter to come back on and see if you have any questions. So this is a good time. If you have a question, we're about 5 minutes out from a moment where we can kind of interact in that way. Now, I mentioned Sand Island. I mentioned Bishop Kurokawa. I should also mention that in Honouliuli, this you can see in this slide a drum, a Buddhist ritual drum that had been donated prior to the war by Masao Sakamoto to the Nichiren mission of Hawaii, and it's held there today in their collection. This drum is also another has a fascinating story to it, and is one of the few artifacts we have of Buddhist life in Honouliuli. But it was it's presumed a drum that was taken to the then bishop of that temple, the Nichiren Mission of Hawaii, the Bishop Kanryu Mochizuki, had been taken like everybody else right after Pearl Harbor, and that the donor of this drum, Masao Sakamoto's wife, had become a caretaker of the temple after the priest was taken away, and that she delivered this drum to him so that he could actually, maintain his faith in camp. Now, if you look at this, the close-up of what is written on the drum, it's inscribed in Japanese with some indication as to how this drum was used. And it actually indicates a date much later than right after Pearl Harbor. It indicates August 15th of 1944, and it's inscribed not by the Nichiren bishop, Kanryu Mochizuki, but by the Soto Zen Buddhist Missions bishop of that time, Zenkyo Komagata. Now, those of you in Hawaii today probably know of current Bishop Komagata, but of course, this is we have several generations of Komagata bishops in Hawaii, but Zenkyo Komagata is the one whose handwriting that we see here, and it writes about the fact that this drum was used to celebrate Obon in camp in 1944. Now, why did he have it and not the Nichiren bishop? What we know is that the Nichiren bishop was among the many that had to leave Honouliuli, go into through that whole Sand Island ship experience to get transferred to the mainland internment camps. And so he probably left this drum with his friend, Bishop Zenkyo Komagata, so that it could be, they could be safely kept with somebody he trusted. And in the case of Bishop Komagata, he was one of the rare Issei Buddhist priests who didn't get transferred to the mainland and was in Honouliuli for much of the war. And it's evidence of Buddhist practice in that camp as well. So the reason I mention this is because what's going on is this in Hawaii after martial law is declared and after all these Buddhist priests are taken and have these internment experiences, whether in Sand Island or Honolulu or the mainland camps, is that they these Buddhist temples all across the islands have a lack of Buddhist priests. As I said in the very beginning, they try to find a Buddhist priest to do the funeral for this member of the Shinshu Kyokai and couldn't find anyone to do it. So who was left? That's what I want to start with when I start part 2 of this evening's lecture. I want to talk about somebody who we mentioned briefly yesterday, Reverend Ernest Hunt, a Caucasian member of the Honpa Hongwanji, a Buddhist priest who received permission from the military government to conduct. He was one of only 2 people given permission to conduct Buddhist activity as Buddhist ministers on the islands, and the other was Reverend Mitsumyo Tottori. He was one of the, not very few, I think the only Buddhist priest who did not experience internment. And so I'm going to be talking about what are these memorial Buddhist, memorial tablets, and why was he able to do what he did during the war in terms of serving the Buddhist community on the island of Oahu, and what did Ernest Hunt do? We're going to get into that in the second half of tonight's presentation. But I'm going to stop things there and come back to these slides later. And I just want to inform the studio at the Buddhist Study Center that I'm now going to stop sharing my from here. I'm looking at the chat area and trying to scroll through it to see if I can see the questions. I thank you very much. I see various comments about tonight's presentation. There is one question about with the detention of Japanese ministers, did a quote-unquote covert Buddhism develop? There's a long Japanese Shin tradition of kakure nembutsu from the 16th century. How did the thousands of lay Japanese Buddhists continue their religions without ministers? And then a second question that I see from Rod Moriyama is, were there any incidents of protests from the community about what was happening? And then the last one I see is, did you indicate in your book that most of the Nisei were really Kibei born in America and then educated in Japan, but came back to Hawaii to live? I wonder why that is. So I will try to take those 3 questions before we go into our break and try to swiftly reply to each one. So the first question, and actually the second one, I'm sorry, the first question is a question that I was going to take up a little bit in the second half of tonight's presentation, but let me try to just articulate it here. For many of the lay Buddhists, once their ministers were gone, it wasn't just that their ministers are gone. The big policy difference between what happened on the Hawaiian Islands and what happened in mainland United States in terms of how people could practice their faith during World War II was that in Hawaii, the military government actually had a policy of a formal policy of encouraging Christianity and discouraging Buddhism. And in fact, not just discouraging Buddhism, but closing down Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines while encouraging attendance and worship at Christian churches, including historically Japanese American Christian churches. So that was the official policy of the government at that time. And you'd think like, well, under the US Constitution, the religion clause of the First Amendment, there's a free exercise clause, and then there's a separation of church and state clause. How could it be that a government can tell people, and of course, if you can recall, many in the Japanese American community, most, in fact, the majority were American citizens. And so how could the government just tell them they couldn't go to their temples? They're going to shut down the Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines and encourage Christian congregation and worship. It was because under martial law, many constitutional rights, whether it's habeas corpus, and okay, I see Dexter's comment about okay. Anyway, I wanted to mention that there is a big difference between what happened under martial law in Hawaii, where people were disallowed from even gathering. And in the second half of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how they actually managed to get back to their temples during the war. And in terms of the question about protests and kibe, unfortunately, we don't have very many, if any, indication of any kind of protests that happened at what was happening with the roundup and shutdown of Buddhist temples, or more broadly, the roundup of Japanese Issei community leaders, or even the roundup of American citizens, including Kibe Nisei. I think these days, if American citizens or even their parents were rounded up in this kind of manner, we can expect that people would question and even protest it quite vocally. But that's just not something that happened in World War II, as far as I've been able to find any documentary evidence. I might talk a little bit in the second half about some people who did find interracial solidarity and coalition, and people of different backgrounds who were helpful to the Japanese American and Japanese American Buddhist community. That's something worth noting. But there weren't any protests as such, as far as I can tell from the historical record. And that last question, and I'm going to go to break because we're about to hit 9 o'clock halfway through our time today. This question about kibe, many kibe, we use the word kibe because, of course, some people were born in America. They went for varying periods of time, sometimes very short periods of time, sometimes much longer periods of time in their childhood, in their adult years, and especially during their teenage years, to receive some kind of bilingual education in Japan and so forth. And eventually, kibe, meaning they returned to American territories or states. And so when war broke out, quite a few of those who were Nisei had had some time of living in Japan and being bilingual and so forth. And again, in the second half, I'm going to be talking about Kibe Nisei and their involvement in a group called the Military Intelligence Service, a group that out of Hawaii, so many people who were bilingual, who had gone to those Japanese language schools or had been educated in Japan, suddenly became massive assets for the American war effort in the Pacific. So I'm going to stop there because those are the three questions I think I had, and I know a few more questions might be coming in, and I'll try to take those on in the second half. But I'm going to turn things back to Dexter or the Control Center to tell us how many minutes we have and how we're going to take a break now.
Okay, I think I'm back from what the Control Center said, so hopefully you can see and hear me okay. The break time is going to be for about 10 minutes. So now's the time to go grab your snacks and stretch your legs, and then come back in 10 minutes. Okay. I have I guess the official clock right now is 6:02 p.m. According to my computer time. So we will reconvene at 6:12. So I know there's a lag time from when I'm speaking and when it shows up on the YouTube feed. So you might not be getting my 6:02. It might look like 6:04 by the time it gets to you. But it's going to be about a 10-minute break. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll see you back here then. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back. We had a great first hour, and we'll continue with the Hawaii experience in the second hour. So I'll turn that back over to Duncan, and welcome back.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dexter. So we're back, and I'm going to again ask the crew in the at the study center to just be aware that I'm going to turn towards sharing my screen again and the PowerPoint presentation. So, and please do alert me if it somehow doesn't show. I'm hoping we are back on the same slide that we left off for our break. Now, there was this question that came up in among the questions about what was life like? Did people have to practice in secret during the war? And I thought maybe that would be something further to explore by reading a short section of American Sutra that describes the two priests who were given official permission to operate during that time. The first was Mitsumio Tottori of the Haleva Shingon Mission. You can see here on the slide in the middle and on the left-hand side these Buddhist memorial tablets, and I'll be referring to them in the reading in a moment, that he hand wrote. Today, remember earlier in the last hour, I mentioned the Liliha Shingonji Mission Temple in Honolulu. They are the holders of these memorial tablets. It's up on their main altar. If you ever have a chance to visit them and see this is a really amazing set of these Buddhist memorial tablets. But let me read a section of American Sutra to give you a sense of what these are. This is on page 221 if you want to follow. So it's not one of the assigned readings for today, but it's in a different part of the book. There are a handful of exceptions to the general inability to honor those who had made the ultimate sacrifice for their country with Buddhist services. Reverend Mitsumio Tottori of the Haleva Shingon Mission, one of the few priests not interned, fulfilled multiple requests for prayers from the families of Nisei soldiers. His daughter recalled he offered many prayers on their behalf. In addition, he personally made toba, wooden memorial tablets for those Hawaii AJA, Americans of Japanese ancestry, men who gave their lives for their country. After his death, his successor found the 420 toba Reverend Tottori had personally dedicated to the Hawaii Nisei killed in combat. In a notebook with all the names of the dead, the first entry was that of Sergeant Shigeo Takata of Waialua, for the first Nisei casualty from Hawaii, who died on September 29th, 1943. My father, this is Reverend Tottori's daughter speaking, my father gave him his posthumous Buddhist name, Yumon-in Chusei Hokoku Koji, which means, for the sake of America, he gave his life. During the course of the war, Tottori served members of the Buddhist community at large, bringing sect-specific sutras to conduct private home memorial services for the many non-Shingon Buddhist families who lost sons in combat. He even created Buddhist memorial tablets for Christians who perished as part of the 100th, 442nd Regimental Combat Team, as he learned of each death on the battlefields of Europe. Immediately after the war, he made an unusually large memorial tablet for the main altar of his temple, which he dedicated to all soldiers from both the American military and the Japanese Imperial Army who lost their lives during the war. Inscribed on the tablet was a prayer to end the animosity between the two nations and a big wish that all who had passed would swiftly attain enlightenment. So I read that just so that you know what these memorial tablets are and how amazing it is that they survived to this day, 420 of them. The one that you see in this picture is the one that I mentioned, Takata Shigeo, the first combat death of somebody on the European front from Hawaii who died in combat. And so that's one of the ways in which Buddhism continued on in the islands. This is how I want to go into the second half of this evening, is to talk about Buddhism and the military in Hawaii. Because in addition to Reverend Totori, the other person that you see on the screen, Reverend Ernest Hunt, he also was given permission by General Emmons initially, the head of the new military government, to hold public Buddhist ceremonies. One of the very few people allowed to do so. There's a section in today's readings where he ends up at a Buddhist temple on the Big Island, and in the middle of the service, a white military officer barges into the service, looks at Reverend Hunt's robes and questions what he's doing there, especially as a Caucasian, and backs down only when he shows General Emmons' letter that he's allowed to perform Buddhist services. And I talk about how Reverend Hunt also, along with Reverend Totori, did services in general, but also in particular for Nisei soldiers whose deaths were coming into focus. And so that's what I want to shift over to in the second half of this evening, and also take a look at this, a gatha, or a song as part of this Buddhist service book, a book containing an order of services for use by Buddhist gatherings. That's the title of this larger book, and this song in there called Buddhist Soldiers. It was composed by Reverend Hunt's wife, Dorothy, who we mentioned yesterday as well, as somebody who contributed as an early convert to Buddhism, and one of her lasting legacies are some of these Buddhist songs. But here she writes about Buddhist soldiers in a manner that's a little bit different than how we might end up discussing them in a moment, but it's also one that's worth keeping in mind. So let me just read the two stanzas, 1 and 4. Have you heard the sound of footsteps as of soldiers marching on? Have you seen their banners waving? Have you heard their battle song? Have you watched their blazing torches lighting up their columns long? Nay, these are the Buddha's soldiers, and the foe they seek to slay is illusion's self that hinders mankind's progress day by day. Righteousness, the sword they carry, wisdom's torch that lights their way. It's an interesting metaphorical understanding of what Buddhists are battling in their lives. Things like illusion and things that would hinder wisdom's torch. And so that's one kind of understanding of what Buddhist soldiers were. And this was, by the way, a book printed by one of Reverend Ernest Hunt's disciples, Julius Goldwater, in Los Angeles. He had an organization called the Buddhist Brotherhood in America. And in 1943, he printed these orders of ceremony for those who were in the mainland War Relocation Authority camps that we'll talk more about tomorrow. These were some of the songs that they were singing in those camps as well. Now, I wanted to start today with the story in this segment of Richard Sakakida. He is featured in American Sutra as well as one of the people who fought in the Pacific. Now, quite well known, I think, in Hawaii and also, quite frankly, among veterans and people who are knowledgeable about World War II history. Quite well known are the groups that served in Europe as part of a segregated group of Japanese Americans, initially from Hawaii called the 100th Battalion, and later they got incorporated into a larger unit group called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a group, again, segregated by race that served in the European theater, and I'm going to talk about them more in a moment. But less well known, and I bring him up first because of that question about the Kibe, less well known are those who served in the Pacific. During the war, about 3,000, and if you include the occupation of right after the war, about 6,000 Nisei served in the Pacific. And according to General Willoughby, shortened the war by 2 years and saved over 1 million American lives because of their actions. So that's a huge accomplishment, but a group that is relatively less known. A group of Japanese Americans who served in the Pacific, not as part of a segregated unit, but embedded in frontline units in the Army and Marine Corps, serving as translators, serving as interpreters, serving as prisoner interrogators, serving as code breakers. Some of them, of course, were not on the front line, but served behind the front lines at these Allied translation centers and so forth. Their work of capturing, translating captured Japanese military documents and so forth, according to the U.S. Army's own assessment, again, saved 1 million American lives and shortened the war by 2 years. And this group of Japanese Americans were predominantly from Hawaii, predominantly bilingual Japanese and English speaking, including Kibe, and predominantly Buddhist. This is because of those who attended the Japanese language schools that we discussed in yesterday's presentation, that the territorial government tried to shut down, that the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed in 1927 as illegal to close down. So one of the people I wanted to talk about today is this gentleman, Richard Sakakida. He attended the Honpa Hongwanji's largest Japanese language school in the pre-war period. And he's a fascinating person because he had the option of becoming the first Nisei to attend on a full scholarship West Point. He had been a cadet corps leader at his high school in Honolulu, and everybody was so impressed with him. They gave him an offer of a full scholarship to go to West Point. He would have been the first Japanese American to do so. But he also had a full scholarship offer from Honpa Hongwanji to go to Kyoto to become one of the first Nisei to ordain and become a Buddhist priest, to then come back to Hawaii to serve in that capacity. Coming from a very devout Buddhist family, as he did, he had these kind of like two different options. His father died when he was young, and so his mother, very devout Buddhist, really wanted him to pursue that path of becoming a Buddhist priest. But he ends up, before the war, turning down both those full scholarships. And what does he do? He goes and works initially at a radio station. He works at a pineapple plantation. And eventually he's recruited by the Counterintelligence Corps that became one of the early feeders into what would eventually become these translators and prisoner interrogators and people who worked in the military intelligence service, the MIS. But he was, even before the war, seen to be so fluent in both English and Japanese, both in terms of language as well as culture, because of his education at the Buddhist language school, that he was given this kind of very prestigious counterintelligence position in which he was, even before the outbreak of war from Pearl Harbor, stationed in the Philippines doing counterintelligence surveillance work for the U.S. Army. So I'm going to read a short bit from American Sutra about what then he experiences when he is, captured as the Philippines falls. I think, as most of you may know, the same, immediately after Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Japanese Imperial Navy also attacked Manila and led to eventually the occupation of the Philippines by the Japanese military. So I'm going to just read the very first bit of, this is on page 151 if you're following the book, a section called Richard Sakakida, American Spy. Richard Sakakida, a U.S. Army intelligence officer captured by the Japanese in the Philippines, calculated his cell in Manila's Bilibid prison, which he shared with 7 prisoners measuring 8 feet by 12 feet. The young Nisei Buddhist from Hawaii had spent his first days in captivity laboring in the prison's work detail. He now steeled himself for the worst, as the Kempeitai, the notorious Japanese military thought police unit with the distinctive white armbands printed with the characters Kempei, took him into the interrogation room. He knew that they would try to beat a confession out of him. The interrogators tied his hands behind his back and strung him up over a rafter, stripped him naked, and started burning various parts of his body with a lit cigarette. Quote, "He started in the area of my thighs. As the days went on, he went up to the area of my abdomen before finally getting to my genitals, hoping all along I would crack. The pain, added to the pain in my arms that already felt dislocated, was indescribable. I was subjected to the same torture day after day. There were times when I felt like screaming as loud as I could, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. After a while, I began to lapse into a state of extreme nausea, compounded by the smell of burning flesh, my own. If I was enraged during the early stages of torture, I was by then delivered into a state of incandescent fury, particularly as he buried the cigarette into my penis. That was the last straw, and I knew that in my state of indescribable rage, my torturer was not about to break the steel-like clamp on my nerves," unquote. Sakakida was not the only Japanese-American intelligence officer to be captured as a prisoner of war by the Japanese military. During his 10-day ordeal, in which he refused to give up any U.S. He was the only one captured. During his 10-day ordeal, in which he refused to give up any U.S. military secrets or even admit to being an American agent, Sakakida relied on his Buddhist faith. He said his Buddhist upbringing made me turn inward, looking for inner strength to counter the pain that had almost reached an unbearable level. Fortunately, my rebelliousness and my Buddhist faith held me in good stead. So I'm going to end there in terms of the reading from American Sutra, but basically it's almost like a Hollywood movie. He gets through the torture, he then engineers a prison escape, he nearly gets killed by some Aboriginal tribe in the Philippines in the jungle that are known as headhunters, although he's actually treated very politely and kindly. He then goes to engineer his own escape and nearly gets shot by American troops who think he's a Japanese soldier. And during all of this experience, which I cover in pages in American Sutra, General MacArthur, who had relied on Sakakita's intelligence reports from the Philippines as a valued asset prior to the war, had sent several teams to try to rescue him, all unsuccessful. And so Sakakita ends up back in, after his escape, back with the American troops, where immediately, this is right around when the war ends, he is appointed by General MacArthur to become the head of the War Crimes Tribunal. And you see him in this slide testifying at that tribunal about not only the torture and abuse that he experienced, but all the things he witnessed. Basically, the story of Sakakita ends in American Sutra when, as his role as the person that's looking out for war crimes, he finally finds and tracks down the 3 Kempeitai officers that had tortured him in Bilibid prison. And they think he's dead at this point. And he has sunglasses on, and he kind of disguises himself. And he goes into the interrogation room with these 3 Kempeitai, or military Japanese thought police officers, and pretends he can't speak any Japanese and has a different interpreter question them about whether they knew somebody called Sakakita. And they were like, no, we never heard of anybody like that. And then dramatically, he takes off his sunglasses and reveals who he is. Immediately, those Japanese Kempeitai officers say, you can do whatever you want with us. We will take responsibility. We did torture you, we did mistreat you, and we did commit war crimes. And in that moment, Sakakita decided to recall something he had learned at Dharma school, at the Buddhist, school that he went to in Honolulu, where he had learned about the Dhammapada, about the Buddha's teachings that anger and hatred is never overcome by more anger and more hatred, but only overcome by the water of love. And he remembered that teaching from his Dharma school and forgave those Kempeitai officers who had done that torture on him when he was captured back in the early days of the war. And so I mentioned this story because it's such an interesting combination. He says he was able to withstand that torture because of his unbreakable Yankee spirit. But he also talks about how he remembers his teachers from Dharma school having that centered, still, calm mind that helped him to withstand the torture. And again, as I mentioned, he relied on the Dhammapada to help him overcome what must have been this tremendous feeling of anger that he held to those who had tortured him. So I know I've taken a long time with Richard Sakakita's story, but it's just so instructive about how Buddhism and the idea of America kind of converged in this one person's story. Post-war, he continued on in the military and had a very successful career as well. And so what I want to do now is just very quickly go to talk about what happened in Europe before closing it out and asking for your questions. In Europe, as I mentioned, initially, this 100th Battalion that was formed out of groups of young Nisei who were already enrolled in the military in Hawaii, as well as those who volunteered, those who had been drafted pre-war, and then combined with volunteers and later draftees from the mainland in this unit, segregated again with Japanese Americans, called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a group that in its own way achieved the type of notoriety for their advance in combat in Italy, in the French campaign, and in the German campaign as well. Always on the front line, dubbed as the Purple Heart Battalion because of the amount of casualties that they suffered. Most of them, just like in the MIS, Buddhist. I wanted to talk about them in relationship to kind of how Buddhism was revived in Hawaii. And just as a very quick side note, this is a visit during March of last year when I met with Reverend Yoshiaki Fujitani at Honpa Hongwanji during the American Sutra book club meeting. He was one of the people I featured in American Sutra as part of this group called the Varsity Victory Volunteers, the Triple V, and how they were the very first group of people who ended up building the base of the 100th Battalion out of Hawaii. And I want to talk about this group because they ended up, as I said, on the front lines. And I want to read a segment of American Sutra that deals with what they went through in terms of combat and how the families back in Hawaii dealt with it. This is a song that was written by one of the mothers of one of these individuals who on the front lines died in combat in Europe. And it comes from a very Buddhist kind of like lens. And so I want to start with this section in American Sutra that begins on page 200, where I set up this particular song or poem. Haru Matsuda was well known in the Japanese American community in Kona, Hawaii, for her original and creative songwriting in the folk song style popular in her native Yamaguchi prefecture. One song she wrote, however, called Gunka, a war song, was decidedly different from her usual compositions. Its highly personal lyrics were about the death of her son Goro, known by his American name Carl. Haru, like so many other women during World War II, became a Gold Star mother, someone who had lost a child in uniform. As the song laments, thousands of miles away from home, under the far-off bright red sunset in Italy, my beloved child is buried under stone. Even though he rushed ahead of everyone to charge the enemy, to say he was a brave soldier is too sad. Oh, how fierce fighting must have been. His fellow soldiers suddenly fell. Carl ran over, for he could not leave his friend, though the strict military rules prohibited acts without orders. Carl went over to encourage him, to hold him, to bandage him in the middle of the battlefield. It was then that Carl was shot, and there he fell. But finally, you've come back to us, loving parents who have waited and waited for your return to your homeland, Hawaii. You've come back guided by the compassionate hands of America. You have come back silently. You've come back silently. Namu Amida Butsu. Namu Amida Butsu. After being informed of Goro's death in combat in Italy, the Matsuda family received a package from the army containing his blood-stained uniform. His sister was shocked by it. Quote, I remember my mother opening up the package, and I was there too. The whole living room was filled up with the smell of old blood from the stained uniform. He was shot. I don't understand why he was sent home to us. Months later, his ashes came back, and after that, he had a memorial service, unquote. In the intervening period between the initial news of his death and the eventual return of his cremated remains, the Gold Star mother composed a song based on the Buddhist folk song rhythms. She made reference to being guided in both life and death by Amida Buddha's compassionate hands, but replaced the Buddha's hands with the hands of America. So I read that and this poem because it shows what life in Hawaii for these Buddhist families who had children who had volunteered or were drafted into the military, who had died in combat, how they felt about it and how they processed it from a Buddhist point of view. And I mentioned that because even though they had been able to integrate Buddhism and Americanism, out on the battlefields assigned to the 100th, this is Chaplain Yost on the left and Chaplain Hiro Higuchi on the right, Hiro Higuchi from Hawaii. There were two others from the mainland chaplains assigned to this segregated unit, the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but all of whom were Christian. And so even though the vast majority of these people who served in Europe in the segregated unit were Buddhists, they couldn't receive Buddhist death rites on the battlefield. And you can see on the left-hand side of this slide, Chaplain Yost with a dog tag when he's making a makeshift grave for a Nisei soldier. And usually on a dog tag, you have things like blood type and, your name and serial number, different key pieces of information, including your religious affiliation. But at that time, the only thing you could put on your dog tag was either C for Catholic, a P for Protestant, H for Hebrew, or X for none, or kind of like other/none. And you couldn't get a B for Buddhist. And so one of the things that happened in Hawaii, as well as actually from the mainland camps, was families started writing to the War Department saying, our children are Buddhist and we want them to have a Buddhist chaplain. We want them to be on their dog tags. And there was a whole campaign of people and families, as you can see on the left side, this mother, you can read Namamida Butsu on the right there, mothers putting together these kind of Buddhist amulets because the military wouldn't allow a bee on the dog tag. People sometimes made personal, just like extra dog tags, just to claim that they were Buddhist. On the right, this is also something that's held at the Nichiren Mission in Honolulu. You can see the words Nam-myoho Renge-kyo in the middle of that, where it says, I am a Buddhist. So you have these dog tags that are self-made. You have these things sent from families as Buddhist amulets that these Buddhist soldiers carried with them on the battlefield. And they try to make do with their Buddhism as much as possible. They relied on their faith as they faced death, despite the fact that the military wouldn't recognize it quite at that time. And one of the, I think, most curious and funny stories, if any of this can be called funny, in American Sutra is the story of one of these young men who go to one of the military registration offices where he's talking about his dog tag. And this is the last, I think, thing I want to read tonight. This is on page 203. He goes to the dog tag. He goes to the draft board. This is in Hawaii, and he's asked. This is two different stories on page 204. In Hawaii, one volunteer reporting to draft board number 7 was asked, "What's your nationality?" When he replied Japanese, the person in charge of processing his dog tag corrected him. He learned that the Army classification for us was Mongolian. When he asked, "What's your religion?" his answer was Buddhist, a response that also prompted a correction. The newly inducted soldier was informed that the Army's classification for us would be Protestant. So during my time in the Army, I was a Mongolian Protestant. And when another young Buddhist asked that his dog tag be marked Buddhist, a scornful Caucasian officer said, "Let me tell you, we don't have the Buddhist religion in the American Army. Pick another one." I then chose Protestant. And when the officer asked me why I selected Protestant, I said, "Because I protest." The angry officer then assigned him to latrine duty. So that's one of the few rare, I think, slightly funny ways, slightly creative ways that Buddhists try to deal with their status in the military. So I'm going to end with that just because I feel like we're running to the end of our time together. I think we, again, have about 10 minutes to take questions. And I just wanted to end with this slide of a family in Honolulu right at the end of the war. This is Private Walter Kanaya's family being awarded a Silver Star, and you can see the Butsudan there at the home where this family is receiving this Silver Star. So these are the kind of experiences that families living in Hawaii, they were left alone in terms of their Buddhist leaders being sent to Sand Island, Honolulu, to the mainland camps. They were left alone in the sense of often their Nisei, sons especially, serving in the military, either in the Pacific or in Europe, and sometimes left alone for good. And so it was a difficult time. And what I want to do is tomorrow connect all of this to what happened on the mainland with the so-called mass incarceration of those living on the West Coast. How did they deal with their Buddhist faith when they were sent to camp? They didn't live under martial law like these families did in Hawaii, but they too had tremendous challenges as they were uprooted from their homes and sent to these camps in the American interior. So I'm going to end there and take things back. I'm just letting the folks know in the control center that I'm going to be stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't want to take any more time from Duncan because his time was short, and I'm sure everybody would rather hear him than me. So there's just trying to give him a chance to read through the chats. There's quite a few questions. I'm not certain that he'll be able to cover everything, but I will leave it to him to select the ones, and maybe some of the questions will be things that can be covered tomorrow. So, Duncan, back to you.
Okay, so there are quite a few questions and quite a few comments about different people who have been wonderfully commenting about information about their own family history, about people who were in Sand Island or Honolulu. And some of the questions seem to be about kind of, there's a seem to be a cluster of questions around like the impact of the war on Buddhism in Hawaii in the immediate aftermath of the war, and how some of what happened during the war in terms of trauma seems to have had effect that lingered across time and generations, and and the kind of second set of questions around loyalty and allegiances when it comes to war and service in the military. And so maybe I'll try to take those two questions up as the kind of big framing questions, and I'll try to answer in such a way that it touches on a few of the other questions as well. I'm sorry if I can't get to every question that I see up there. So I think one of the things about what happens when you are in a period of war, when your loyalty is questioned, when Buddhist priests and Japanese Americans are targeted for suspicion, incarceration, and other forms of discrimination, certainly that does have an effect on whether or not Americanization is sped up or decreased. This is one of the questions that I saw in the chat. Is it sped up or decreased when it comes to war? And one of the things I'm going to say is that it's kind of based on what I mentioned yesterday, is that the processes of what constitutes Americanization is a complicated question. Sometimes when we use the word Americanization, it is about assimilating towards certain things that are in the dominant culture. So for example, meeting on Sundays, that kind of model of congregationalism that is so strong in American life, where it's not just Buddhists, but let's say Jews and other traditions of people have assimilated towards this idea of kind of like setting aside a day of the week for congregational activity. That's certainly something that was happening before the war even, but accelerated through the course of the war and thereafter. So that's one facet or dimension, is that wartime, especially if your existence in society is being questioned, your loyalty attacked, sometimes that tends to accelerate certain things. But the thing about Americanization of Buddhism is that it's also the case that Buddhism brings something new to the table. And so it's not just that Buddhism changes by coming to America, but America changes by coming into contact with Buddhism. And so, and that process of back and forth is what I would call the Americanizing process of Buddhism. And so it's not just about assimilation, but it's also about Buddhists bringing something new to the table. And so when somebody like Richard Sakakida, whose story I dwelt on a little bit in the second hour, says it's his Yankee spirit and his Buddhist faith that kind of merged and melted together so that he could not only withstand the torture, serve in not only World War II, but even thereafter as an American veteran, and also forgive his Japanese captors. It's this very delicate dance between what it is that constitutes the making of American Buddhism in these kind of times. And I do think that because of some of the trauma I talk about in the book, and I didn't even get to today, temples being targeted for arson, Jizo statues being shot at, other kinds of very destructive and negative. Yesterday's talk, I talked about sympathy and antipathy of the general society vis-a-vis Buddhism. It was no different during World War II. There were those who quietly supported as allies and in solidarity across racial lines Japanese Americans and Japanese American Buddhists in these difficult times, but there was also antipathy as well. And so the trauma of that certainly continues post-war, and that's certainly a topic I want to get to in day 3, 4, 5 later in this seminar. So the last thing I'm going to talk about, that second question about loyalty and allegiance, especially if there are families where there might have been Issei parents or so forth that had, their hearts may have been with Japan, while the American-born Nisei think of themselves as American citizens first and foremost. As we might recall, Issei weren't even allowed to naturalize. Unlike European immigrants, Asians weren't allowed to naturalize under American law. In the case of the Chinese, that changed during World War II, but in the case of the Japanese and most other Asian groups, didn't change until well after World War II. And so there was certainly some level of divided or conflicted loyalty in that sense of families with different allegiances where, for example, there are Buddhist priests in Hawaii as well as in the mainland who had sons serving both in the 100th and 442nd Regimental Combat Team, as well as in either the Japanese Imperial Army or Navy. And so what do you do when you have children who are in, serving in the armies that consider themselves enemies? In American Sutra, I talk about a few of those families, how they handled that kind of thing, but it must have been a very, very difficult moment for families like that. There are these fascinating stories of Nisei who served in the Pacific in particular, who end up meeting their siblings or meeting a relative in combat, in an internment camp, in Japan, and so on and so forth. It's a very complicated history. And so let me end with that notion that these are complex times. What is American? What is Japanese American? What is Buddhist? What is Japanese American Buddhism? These are complicated things that are being navigated and formulated in the context of war. And tomorrow, what I want to do is talk a little bit about what happened in the mainland, where, unlike in Hawaii, where the Japanese were the dominant ethnic demographic on the Hawaiian Islands in that period, in places like Oregon, Washington, California, and certainly places outside of the West Coast, the Japanese were in a very minoritized, small percentage kind of demographic situation. And so what happens when 110,000 Japanese Americans are forcibly removed from their homes, losing their businesses, losing everything that they had worked hard for, and sent to these camps in the American interior? How do they, in that moment of dislocation, find meaning, find a direction and orientation from their faith, Buddhism? And so that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. And I'm going to try to reply to some of the other questions that were posed in the chat and integrate it in my discussions for tomorrow. So let me send things back to Dexter. I think we're just right at the point where we need to close.
Okay, thank you, Duncan. Thank you for your masterful presentations. I think for everybody, things are just beginning to unfold. The flower is beginning to open. We had a lot more questions this time. I think some of these are, parts of what you're going to be developing, as the lecture series unfolds and develops. So, I hope that the audience will continue to join us, because the subject is so big. It's difficult to find a way to present it in a way that makes sense and flows. And Duncan's doing a great job. So tomorrow, as Duncan said, we'll be looking at more of the mainland experience. Today was kind of the Hawaii day, and the religious freedom and Buddhism in World War II. That information can be found in, this brochure, which is available, at the BSC website, and the full syllabus is there, as well as, some of the readings, although the readings from chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, which is about 100 pages, It comes from American Sutra, and but it's very compelling, reading for those of you that have been, trying to, get the background information. So without further ado, I'll say good evening, and thank you very much for attending the second night of the 5-night summer session. And until tomorrow,